Hello everyone and welcome to Pyanodons mods. This is Otaku Showboat and today we will be discussing nickel processing yet again. If you have been enjoying these tutorials thus far, please be sure to do all of the engagement and social stuff below the video. This series is of course supported by my patrons at patreon.com/otakushowboat, and don't forget that you can also support Pyanodons mods development at patreon.com/pyanodon. So, nickel. Nickel is pretty straightforward. It's not got any issues as far as I can tell with it overall, thankfully, unlike some of the other stuff. Not much has really been changed or even touched with nickel since the last time I discussed it. The primary change being that hot air processing of all of the various metals is now a bit different. You cannot do hot air casting on non-molten metal casting. It's now exclusively on molten metal casting, and we will have a good look at that going forward. But let us begin by looking at nickel techs. So at Red Science, you will get access to the grade 1 nickel process into plates. At level 2, you'll get access to your first molten recipe out of grade 4, as well as the hot air casting from grade 4. At level 3, you will have access to several stopping points, including Pulp 1, Pulp 2, Pulp 4, and high grade, and we will take a look at each of those in sequence. You also note get access to the molten-based nichrome recipe at nickel processing 3, so definitely consider blitzing your way into this as quickly as possible, along with the chromium level 3 to get access to molten chromium, because this is a very important recipe. Nichrome is pretty expensive on the nickel and chromium amounts, and in particular, at this very moment in time that I am recording this video, there is no hot air nichrome recipe yet. It might happen, it might not happen. Every single other alloy has hot air casting associated with it, but not nichrome for some reason. And it's one of the most expensive of the alloys that will just eat all of your nickel and chromium as you go along, especially in the later phases of the game, because some of the stuff just needs tons of nichrome, or needs tons of both nickel and chromium separately rather than as the form of nichrome. And then, of course, at Utility Science, you get reduction and sintering processes. We will ignore that this recipe for sintered out of high grade exists because it is going to be deleted in one of the coming high raw ores releases. It will be deleted across the board. It is never worth doing. It doesn't need to exist, so it will cease to exist going forward. It is half of the output compared to doing the reduction and desintering, and there's no real reason why you would skip reduction to go straight to sintering. And oftentimes you end up actually with less output of molten by doing high grade into sintered, because overall sintered produces less molten than high grade for the amount of sintered that goes into it versus high grade. And that's just a general rule across the board. So it's just going to get removed completely. Anyway, let's have a look at what this looks like in terms of all of the various chains. As you can probably see here, as we go from the very bottom all the way up to the top, there is absolutely no issue with the scaling of the outputs of plates in this particular process. It does scale quite nicely as we get into more and more complex processes. But here at the very beginning, the direct ore into plates that you technically have access to from the very early phases of the game, just noting that you do need to have syngas, I believe, to actually mine nickel to begin with. Let's see, is there a nickel that I can show on this map anywhere nearby? There's a nickel node, but there's a nickel ore. So nickel is absolutely 4 units of syngas. Uh, that's pretty common. Most of the resources will require syngas to mine. Chromium requires it. Nickel requires it. The let's see. The niobium is refined syngas. The aluminium is coal gas. The tin is steam. Etc. 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 The zinc is also syngas. So a few things use syngas. A few things use syngas. Now, bearing that in mind, that means you will not actually be doing any nickel mining until you actually are at red science and are able to make syngas in the first place. So chances are you will not be doing this. This is also why this factory is an advanced foundry, because, well, you'll have access to this building by this point. Also, this is 10 to 1 on ore to plate ratio, which is not all that great to begin with. So at red science, you will have access to creation of grade 1 nickel in jaw crushers that you can then cast in foundries. In this case, we have doubled our output of nickel plates compared to the previous step in this process. There is a building that you can make at red science that needs nickel. If I need to go into Hellmod to have a look at this, because I do not have what is it really used for on this particular map. But if I do a search for nickel and filter by ingredients on the plates, and I have a look in the Pi Alien Life, we can see that the atomizer has a nickel plate requirement, and this is a red science unlock. So yes, if you want to use the atomizer, you will need some nickel. It's generally speaking, you're not really gonna need this. If you are playing Pi Block, you have access to a Mark 0 variant of the atomizer earlier that does not need nickel, and you can actually get nickel earlier because it is just made out of tar. In an ionic upgrader, so as soon as you get the ionic upgrader, you can make nickel. But point being is that the absolute earliest you would even think about having nickel is to get the atomizer. Otherwise, a lot of this other stuff that the nickel gets used for comes a fair bit later on in the process. You can see ore is used for crude cermets, which is part of the Circuit 2 chain. These other items are mainly Circuit 3 stuff in here. You could theoretically do some particle acceleration from nickel plates to get niobium, but I don't see the point in that particular option. I don't see the point for that. You do, of course, need nickel to get into stainless steel. And there's an upgraded version of the stainless steel that is using the molten nickel. Lots of stuff uses it. It's just getting to the earliest point in which you need it, in which this would be a pretty good one here. The hydrogen peroxide that is part of your Circuit 2s. So the hydrogen peroxide part of this, if I search for that, of course that's not the actual name of the fluid. Now, is it hydrogen? It is dash peroxide. Why did you not? Why you no show up? That's Hellmod. That's just Hellmod. That's just Hellmod for you. Peroxide. I wanted to bring up what you use it for. So the hydrogen, actually, this is actually showing what it's used for. The etching solution. After all that time, etching solution is what it's used for, which you need to get PCB2s. So that's going to be like one of your first demands on nickel. And then a lot of hydrogen peroxide gets used for various things after that as you get into the late game. So do bear all of this in mind, that generally speaking, you'll be at green science. You'll be at green science when you get access, you have a need to consume the nickel plates on a consistent basis. That will generally speaking be at green. It will not just be in the form of plates, it will be in the form of nichrome as well. So always, always, always have some overproduction of your nickel for that. Now, at green science, of course, after simply crushing our ore into grade 1, we get access to a much bigger process to get all the way into molten casting of our nickel. This is one of the earlier molten processes that you can do, and also one of the earlier methods that goes all the way up to grade 4 at green. So, or shall we say, it only is grade 1 into casting at red, and you get access to the rest of it at green. So, the grade 1 will get screened into a reject, a grade 2, and a grade 3. The grade 2 can get impact crushed back down to grade 1, and then the rejects can also get secondarily crushed back into additional grade 1. So this all loops back to improve the output of grade 3 in the end. You will also have to deal with all of these byproducts, the standard byproducts of stone, gravel, and sand. So definitely have something in mind for getting rid of all 3 of those. The grade 3 will get ball milled, powdered into a grade 4 nickel, and then that can get converted into molten in a basic oxygen furnace by adding in borax, oxygen, and any solid fuel. And then you can cast that with hot air and sand castings into a bunch of more plates. Like, that is a lot more plates. Almost 4 times as many plates as the previous process. So, definitely worth considering doing this when you do need your nickel. However, depending on your timing of when you set up your nickel, you may be able to go a little bit beyond this. It all depends on whether or not the next step uses a jig or not. The next set of steps uses a jig, because that sort of limits you to stainless steel. But as we can see here, the very next process that you get access to at Blue Science, which you can, theoretically, get into Blue Science through VatBrain Biocomputing. So in the light of the existence of VatBrain Biocomputing, let's say that you haven't yet set up a proper nickel processing, and you're sort of holding back on setting up something more complex. You're like on your grade 1 processing only, and you're just waiting for something a little bit better before devoting the time to do the major upgrade. You don't really have much of a demand for it yet. You can actually get into VatBrain Biocomputing without any expenditure of nickel, consistent expenditure of nickel, which is quite useful. And at Blue Science, you get access to several stopping points. So let's have a look at each one of these. So from our grade 4, this is going to be one of the biggest roadblocks, in that this is a significant amount of sulfuric acid for just 15 ore in. This is a very significant amount of sulfuric acid. So that's gonna be the biggest, I think, roadblock for you. The biggest point of consideration as to whether or not you would want to go all the way up to grade 4 into Molten or go past it into the beginnings of the process to go into high grade, because this is a lot. This is a lot for the early phases of getting into chemical science. Um, you need sulfuric acid to get into chemical science, so especially in the light of vat brain biocomputing, if you got here through vat brain, you might not have the output of the sulfuric acid at this point in time. So definitely a point of consideration. And it's hydrocyclones, which does place this post niobium, because these need niobium pipes as well. So that's the earliest you can think about doing that, is after niobium and after vat brain biocomputing to get the tech that unlocks this process. But anyway, from here, our grade 4 makes a prepared nickel pulp by adding all of that huge amount of sulfuric acid. Then it gets agitated with limestone and salt into the pulp stage 1. And as we had seen before, the pulp stage 1 gets processed directly into molten, can get processed directly into molten in basic oxygen furnaces with borax and oxygen and any solid fuel. And that casts into a few additional plates. Is it worth stopping here after spending all 112.6 per second of sulfuric acid for like 3, not even 3, barely even 2 additional plates? Nah. Nah. Like, just for a little over 2 additional plates per second? No. No, it's not. It's never going to be worth doing that particular process. It is a gain in output, but not significant enough. So, what about the next option for a stopping point? The next option for a stopping point is grade 2, or is pulp stage 2. In this case, we add one more step. We will float our pulp 1 with water and pressurized air. With water and pressurized air to make our pulp 2. It's not the making of the pulp 2 that is the hard part here, why you would consider doing the 1 versus the 2. It's the fact that you then have to electrolyze your pulp 2 with graphite, aluminium plates, and boric acid, which, grand scheme, this 168.8 is not a lot of the raw borax. It's hardly any, because remember that boric acid is not very dense of a material. It just divide this number by 5 for the amount of diborane that's needed here, and then you can convert how much borax is required to make that diborane. It's not that much, effectively. Just like this extra little plate here is not that much, neither is this graphene, or graphite, I should say. So these aren't that bad. You also get a little bit of pyrite as a byproduct that you would have to deal with in here. And it does make a pretty good amount of extra plates. It makes this look a little bit better. You do gain nearly 6 plates out of doing this, almost 6 plates. But we can go better than this. So, the next process. Oh yeah, and just by the way, we're going to get in this next part a whole bunch of outside inputs being added. A lot more complexity is going to be added by the outside inputs in this next set of stuffs. So, improving our output. We get a big improvement of output by going all the way up to pulp 4. So from our pulp 2, we need a leaching station by adding glycerol, which, yeah, glycerol is definitely a thing. That is not very nice, but it's used in low amounts to make a nickel overflow. this nickel overflow can be thrown into a centrifugal pan and mixed with xylanol. Remember that from iron processing as well as other things. Other things. It's used in rock coal as well as iron and nickel. Rock coal, iron, and nickel. That's what it's primarily used for. There's also these joke recipes to make combustion mixture out of them. We ignore those at all times. So, glycerol is the first thing, then xylanol, and then the overflow needs to be added to methanol, a bunch of methanol, through all of the various methods of making methanol that exist. There's many methanol recipes, of which my suggestion is always going to be, at this phase, uh, probably this, with the tin chromium alloy expenditure out of natural gas directly or any other main natural gas. The copper TiCl4 is somewhat tempting. So is this strip distillates. Like, there's a lot of various options available to get into methanol. Some of which are better than others, some of which are far more expensive than others. But either way, when you do that, you will get a nickel slime as well as nickel tailings. Nickel slime, that is the previous thing that you added xylanol to. So this is a little bit of a loop, as you can see. So I worded this poorly previously. You centrifuge the slime. Technically, that needs to be after this, because you take the overflow, throw it in a methanol reactor, you get slime, you centrifuge the slime back to overflow by adding the xylanol to it. That's the proper way of describing this. If someone already commented about that, sorry, but I've already addressed it in this video. Moving along. So it's pulp 2 into overflow, overflow with methanol into slime, and tailings, slime, add xylanol to get back into more overflow to get more tailings. The tailings, you need to add ammonium chloride, which there are two methods of getting ammonium chloride. There is a whole bunch of stuff into 2 plus sodium carbonate, a whole bunch of relatively easy to obtain stuff, but still rather expensive for 2, or, hydrogen chloride plus ammonia to get 5. 100 ammonia plus 200 nitrogen plus 200 carbon dioxide plus 20 salt to get 2 plus carbonate, versus 100 hydrogen chloride and 100 ammonia into 5. I'm probably going to go the route and say the hydrogen chloride is better here to spend it, just because that's a pretty big difference in the output. But consider that at this point, you do have access to the nitrogen-based ammonia recipe, the nitrogen-hydrogen chromium recipe. This saves you the pain of making the hydrogen chloride. So it's up to you. Do you want something that's a little bit overall simpler by not having to make additional hydrogen chloride, or do you want to just make the hydrogen chloride and get the extra output from it? It's up to you. Up to you on that front. Either way, you only need 0.75 of this for every 15 ore per second in. So do bear that in mind. You do need to input sand. You are scrubbing these tailings to make a pulp stage 3. You then need to float with Aerofloat 15, which needs crysylic acid, which and phosphorus pentasulfide. We have discussed just how painful Aerofloat 15 actually is to make, because that phosphorus pentasulfide, yeah, that's going to use phosphate rocks to make it, as well as the crysylic acid is going to be using phenol. So yeah, it's a bit of stuff. It's pretty expensive to make it, and it's used in several of the ore processing processes, this one included. And that gives you your pulp stage 4. So after spending all of these extra outside inputs, we can increase our output, the same process in our BOFs, to 35 8.44 for 15 ore in, which is, pretty significant compared to that 11.82 way back here without any outside inputs. However, this is not the very end of this process that we have access to at Chemical Science. If we have decided to go all the way up to Pulp 4, well, we may just want to keep going to high grade. It's only 2 more steps to get up to high grade to maximize our output of plates slash molten that we also need for nichrome at this phase. So from our Pulp 4, you need to add chromium and syngas in a wet scrubber. A not insignificant amount of the chromium I'll add, the 1.5. It's low, but still not trace. So, it's fine. Don't worry. It's fine. We're totally spending additional chromium to use nickel to add to more chromium to make nichrome. It's going to be fine. I hope. It just means more chromium is required for our stuffs. Prepared nickel solution is made out of this. Then we need a filter to add biofilm through whatever biofilm you want to use. At this point, it's either going to be one of these two with the lime biomass rayon or the cellulose basic substrate. So you have the option between cellulose or rayon. Yeah, I'm gonna pick the cellulose any day of the week versus rayon. Do not spend your rayon this way. Rayon is a very precious resource to make batteries as well as to do particle acceleration for your crystallographic substrate. Don't spend it on biofilm. That sounds like a terrible idea if you have the option. So that will of course give you your high grade nickel that can then make 42.53 plates, 67.5 molten per second out of 15 ore in. So that is a lot versus the 11.82 back here without any outside inputs. But if we actually look at what these outside inputs are, well, we've got xylenol, we've got methanol, we've got glycerol, we've got ammonium chloride, we've got Aerofloat 15, chromium, biofilm, sand, which doesn't really count either, a bunch of sulfuric acid and salt, a ton of sulfuric acid and some salt. Is it worth the times, let's just say times 4, it's like 3 something output versus this? Is it worth the extra 30-ish plates for the ore in? If you have the ability to mine more, probably not. If you have the ability to mine more, you should think about just mining more and sticking to this, because it is so much sulfuric acid to begin with, plus Aerofloat 15, that you may want to skip this particular high-grade process. Yes, you need a ton of molten, but if you have access to a lot of ore, definitely consider it. If you don't have easy access to infinite supplies of ore, or near infinite supplies of ore, then absolutely go all the way up to high grade, and you'll be set up for hitting utility science and going beyond this. So, speaking of utility science, at utility science, for those of us who have plans beyond just hitting space science and want actual production of have goals for science production before we end off our game. At utility, you get access to reduction and sintering. Reduction is the exact same process as we have seen in the past. Add sodium sulfate and diesel and pressured air to your high grade to get reduced. You can then make molten out of your reduced, and that'll give you a pretty big boost, over the high grade. And then, of course, if you then add sintering from that reduced, by adding lime and syngas and any solid fuel to fuel your sinter units, or sinter plants, I should say, because that apparently changed its name on me at some point. This will make 94.5, which is a pretty big bonus. Is this worth doing? Yeah. This is absolutely worth doing out of your 15 or in, especially when you have huge demands to meet production goals going into the future. So there's that. I have a kitty who wants to say hi. This is Ollie as he wants to squirm his way away. He came to say hi here at the very end, so I guess it's more to say goodbye. Because we have discussed all of these things regarding this. Just to reiterate, I think that if you have access to a whole bunch of nickel ore, you probably don't want to go up all the way to high grade, even though you do need a ton of molten for your chromium, as well as a whole bunch of plates for the hydrogen peroxide expenditures as you go on towards the later phases of the game. Even in light of that, I think just processing more nickel in the grade 4 process is gonna get you by. But if you do have production goals, you'll still want to think about doing it anyways as you get into utility science, because later phases it gets significantly easier to get sulfuric acid. As time goes on, it gets significantly easier to get your sulfuric acid. It gets significantly easier to get into xylanol, to get into glycerol, to get into methanol, to get into ammonium chloride, to get into the Aerofloat 15 as well. Like, by the time you're getting into utility science, you have access to so many better processes, so many better biotic processes that are faster, more productive, etc., to be adequately feeding these sets of outside inputs for your ore processing. So I will always suggest definitely going through the high grade stuff and into your sintering when you get access to sintering. Like, that's always going to be worth it going into sintering for all of the main metal types. So with that being said, of course, I would like to thank you all for watching. If you have been enjoying this tutorial series thus far, please be sure to do all of the engagement and social stuff below the video. And if you want to see more of me, I stream on Twitch at twitch.tv/Otaku Showboat. This series, of course, is supported by my patrons at patreon.com/Otaku Showboat, and you can, of course, also support Pyanodon's mods development at patreon.com/Pyanodon. I will, of course, see you all on the next one.